It started like any ordinary school morning, cereal crunching in a quiet kitchen, a lunchbox zipped shut, and a mother gently urging her son to put on his shoes before the bus pulled up. But this morning would quietly signal the beginning of something no one could explain. No one except maybe you watching right now, because by the end of the story you will understand what really happened and why it matters more than you can imagine. I want you to stay with me, not just to hear a story, but because there's a detail, a single unsettling detail, that changes everything, and trust me, it's not what you think. You clicked on this video because something in that title spoke to you. Maybe curiosity, maybe something deeper, maybe a strange feeling you've had before that you couldn't shake, a moment that didn't make sense, but lingered anyway. I know that feeling. And this story, this one about a child and a stranger from his drawings, is going to reach into those hidden parts of you. You're not just watching a video. You're part of a search, a mystery. And by the time we reach the end, you'll know why this child was drawing the same face every single week, and why someone had every reason to hope no one would ever find out. Now, let's rewind to the boy at the center of this mystery. His name is Mason. 8 years old. Smart, shy, and always the last kid to leave art class. He didn't like sports, didn't talk much in class, and always sat near the window like he was waiting for something or someone. His teachers described him as gentle and thoughtful, but even they didn't notice the quiet pattern that had been building behind the scenes. Until one morning, his third-grade teacher, Ms. Castillo, glanced over Mason's shoulder during art hour and saw something that made her stop mid-sentence. On his page wasn't a superhero or a cartoon character or a scribbly self-portrait like the other kids were drawing. It was a face. A man's face. And it was realistic. Eerily detailed. Dark, watchful eyes. A shadow of a beard. A deep scar along one cheek. Not something you'd expect from a third grader, not even close. But what chilled her more than the drawing itself was what Mason said when she asked him about it. He comes in my dreams. Every week. And he just watches me. Let that sink in for a moment. A child, barely old enough to ride his bike alone, was dreaming of the same man again and again, enough to remember every contour of his face and recreate it in graphite with eerie precision. And it wasn't just that one time. Every single week, for months, Mason would sit down at his desk and draw the same man over and over. No matter the assignment, no matter the season, always the same hollow stare, the same sharp jawline, and that same scar. And if you're already getting goosebumps, hold on, because what happens next will haunt you. You see, we've all heard about kids having vivid imaginations, right? Imaginary friends. Monsters under the bed. Dreams that blur the line between sleep and waking life. But what if one of those dreams wasn't fiction at all? What if a child's drawing wasn't just a product of his mind, but a warning? And here's where things take a sharp turn. Ms. Castillo, deeply unsettled, brought the drawings to the school counselor. The counselor, concerned, called Mason in and gently asked him to talk about the man. Mason didn't hesitate. He said the man never spoke, never moved. Just stood at the edge of the forest behind his house. He's waiting, Mason whispered. He said I'll know when it's time. The counselor brushed it off at first. Maybe Mason had seen someone on TV or in a movie, and his mind just held on to it. But the drawings kept coming. And here's the part that no one, not even his mother, understood until it was too late. Mason never saw the man in real life. Or at least he shouldn't have. So why, when the school finally reached out to local police with the drawings, more out of caution than anything else, did the sketch artist, seasoned in decades of field work, go pale? Because the face Mason had been drawing wasn't random. It matched a man who had been on their radar once. A suspect in a case that was never solved. A man who vanished years ago and was believed to be either dead or in hiding. And get this, the scar? That wasn't in any media coverage. That was confidential case detail. Which brings us to the question I know is burning in your mind right now. How does an 8-year-old boy draw the exact face of a man he's never met, never seen, and never should have known about? I want you to really think about this. Because this isn't just about a creepy drawing. It's about memory, identity, and the strange ways our minds connect to the unknown. Some people call it intuition. Others say it's psychic. Or maybe it's something else entirely, something we can't explain yet, but are closer to understanding than we realize. And whether you're a parent, a teacher, or just someone fascinated by true stories that toe the line between the eerie and the impossible, this one is going to stay with you. I promise, this isn't the kind of mystery that ends where it starts. In fact, the deeper we go, the stranger it gets. Now, let's talk about Mason's mom, Julia. Single mother. Works 2 jobs. She didn't notice the drawings at first. Not because she didn't care, but because life was moving too fast. Bills, routines, and trying to protect her son from the world's harshness made her miss the signs. But when she finally saw the stack of papers in Mason's backpack, face after face, each one identical, she froze. It wasn't just the image. It was the intensity behind the pencil strokes. Like the hand drawing them wasn't Mason's anymore. And that's when she did something that would unknowingly pull the lid off everything. She took a photo of the drawing and uploaded it to a local Facebook parenting group, asking innocently, "Has anyone seen this man? My son keeps drawing him." What happened next sent shockwaves through their small town. People started commenting fast. Some thought it was a prank. Others felt disturbed. But then, a private message came in from a woman across the county. She said she'd seen that face before. Years ago, in a case that went cold. Her sister's case. A disappearance that was never solved. Suddenly, this wasn't about just one boy's dream. This was about something real. A thread connecting people who had no business being connected. And as more people weighed in, the same name came up again and again. A name that had long since been buried. A man no one had spoken of in nearly a decade. Until Mason brought him back. Pencil stroke by pencil stroke. Right now, you're probably leaning in. Your thoughts racing.
And you should be.
Because here's the truth. This video isn't just going to show you what happened. It's going to take you inside it. You're going to see what Mason saw. You'll hear from the people who lived this nightmare. And yes, you're going to learn exactly who that man was, why he vanished, and why Mason was the only one who could bring him back. But before we get there, I need you to remember something. This story builds like a puzzle. Each piece might seem random, even impossible, but I promise you, they all fit. And the final image? It's not just going to shock you. It's going to make you question what you believe about dreams, and what they're trying to tell us. The next morning began like any other. A sleepy sunrise casting long shadows through the blinds, birds chirping outside the bedroom window, and Mason quietly eating his cereal at the kitchen table while Julia scrolled through her phone, barely alert. There was nothing unusual in the air. No chill, no sudden sign that something was wrong. But Julia couldn't shake the words from the night before. He said tomorrow, you'll see him too. They played in her mind like a looping track, each repetition stirring more unease. She told herself it was just a dream, just one of those weird things kids say when they're half asleep. And yet, as Mason looked up from his bowl that morning, his eyes didn't hold the warmth she was used to. There was no smile, no morning grogginess, just a kind of focus, like his thoughts were somewhere far beyond the kitchen walls. And when she asked if he slept okay, he gave a slow nod, then said, "He's close now." Julia didn't know what to make of it. But something told her not to ask too many questions, not yet. Later that day, at school, Mason barely spoke. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't eat much at lunch. And he didn't draw during art time, which Ms. Castillo found especially odd. For the first time in months, his paper remained blank. When she gently nudged him to pick up a pencil, Mason simply said, "I'm not supposed to draw him anymore." He said the message is sent. That afternoon, Julia was called in for a meeting. The counselor, now deeply concerned, wanted to talk about Mason's behavioral changes. He wasn't disruptive, he wasn't aggressive, but something about his detachment unsettled them. They mentioned disassociation, possible trauma triggers, even early signs of dissociative coping. But none of it made sense to Julia. Mason wasn't exposed to violence, wasn't online unsupervised, and didn't spend time with anyone strange. His world was school, home, and the occasional visit to his grandma's place across town. So, how could he know this man? How could he describe him in such detail, down to the faded army patch on the jacket, a detail that would only come to light weeks later, long after everything had fallen apart. In search of answers, Julia did something desperate. She began digging through old family albums, social media posts, and even an online ancestry service, trying to see if there was anyone in their family tree who resembled the man in Mason's drawings. She didn't want to believe it, but there had to be a connection. Maybe it was a long-lost uncle, or someone who had once been in Mason's father's life, someone who left behind an echo. But nothing fit. Mason's father had left when he was a baby, and there had been no contact since. No photos, no messages, no updates. It was like he vanished. That absence had always hung over them, quietly, like a missing puzzle piece. And though Julia had long since stopped wondering if he'd return, this sudden mystery seemed to pull that wound wide open again. Could it be him? Could Mason somehow remember a face he shouldn't know? And yet, when she showed Mason a picture of his father from back in 2014, Mason shook his head. "That's not him," he said softly. "He's not in our family." Meanwhile, the Facebook post began gaining traction outside the parenting group. Local true crime forums picked it up, tagging it under trending searches like "creepy kid drawing real man," "unsolved cold case twist," and "child predicts criminal face." It wasn't long before a retired detective named Ray Blanton reached out. He'd worked cold cases out of state, but something about Mason's drawing struck him. He asked Julia if she would mind showing him the physical sketches. Reluctantly, she agreed. When Ray arrived, he was quiet, professional, but something in his expression changed the moment he saw the stack of drawings laid out on the table. He didn't say much at first, just kept glancing back at Mason, who sat in the living room quietly flipping through a book. Finally, Ray leaned in and said, "This face, it matches someone I chased years ago. We never caught him. Disappeared after 2 kidnappings. No closure. No trace. The scar, that wasn't public. Only the task force knew about it. We always believed he had a military background because of how he moved, how clean he was. He left no DNA, no evidence. Just vanished." At this point, Julia was no longer skeptical. She was afraid. And not just for her son, but for herself. What did it mean that Mason was drawing this man? Why had he stopped? And most disturbingly, why did Mason now claim he wasn't the only one who could see him? Ray offered to look deeper, to reopen what little he could with his contacts. But he also left her with a warning. If your son is seeing him, somehow, there's a reason. Don't assume this is over. That night, Julia locked every door and window. But it didn't help her sleep. Especially not after what Mason said as she tucked him in. "Mom, if he comes, don't talk to him. Just run." But as unsettling as Mason's visions were, the more confusing part was the lack of any physical signs. No strangers had been spotted in the neighborhood. No unusual cars. No reports from other parents. It was as if the man only existed in Mason's world. Or so they thought. Because the next day, during recess, one of Mason's classmates told the teacher something strange. She said she saw a man standing at the edge of the woods during their playtime. He was watching us. But when I blinked, he was gone. A search of the perimeter turned up nothing. No footprints. No tire marks. Just a vague unease that lingered well into dismissal. And as more kids began mentioning seeing a man in the trees, it became clear this wasn't just one child's fantasy anymore. The figure was spreading, like a shadow across their minds. This is where the story twists. Because around this same time, a man named Jared Keller came forward. A former substitute teacher from a neighboring district, Jared claimed he recognized the face in Mason's drawing. Said it resembled someone who used to work with him at a rural survivalist camp about 15 years ago. "He went by Mitch," Jared recalled, "but I never trusted him. He was quiet, observant, gave me the creeps. Always lingered around the older boys. Disappeared after one summer, just never showed up again." Police followed up, but the camp records had long since been purged. No last name. No social security number. Just a series of grainy photographs that offered little clarity. Still, the scar, it matched. Jared's tip wasn't conclusive, but it planted doubt. Was this the same man Mason had seen? Or just someone similar? Was Mason subconsciously absorbing this story through whispered rumors or subconscious memory? Or was something far stranger at play? And here's where the red herrings begin to cloud everything. Julia's estranged brother, Anthony, a man with a checkered past and known PTSD episodes from his time in service, re-entered their lives around the same period. He had a scar on his cheek too, fainter, more recent. He'd been in town for work, but hadn't told Julia. When asked, he said he hadn't seen Mason in years. But Mason's reaction when he saw his uncle was chilling. He stared for a long moment, then said, "That's not him. But he's scared too." No one understood what he meant by that, least of all Anthony, who left soon after, visibly shaken. Was it guilt? Recognition? Or had Mason projected something onto him that wasn't real? The suspicion made Julia question everything. And it made Anthony disappear again, this time by choice. All the while, Mason had begun sleepwalking. Julia would wake in the middle of the night to find him standing by the back door, staring out at the trees. Sometimes he'd mumble. Sometimes he'd cry. And sometimes he would laugh. But never like a child. It was deeper, older. It made Julia feel like she wasn't listening to her son anymore, but someone speaking through him. And each time she tried to ask what he was seeing, Mason would only respond with a version of the same thing. "He's almost here." She kept him home from school after that. Bought new locks. Covered the windows. But nothing seemed to shake the sense that the man was closing in, and Julia still didn't know why. Then came the knock at the door. 3 short raps. No one there. No car in the driveway. Just a slip of paper folded once and stuck between the frame. No writing on the front. Inside, a single sentence. "Ask Mason what happened at the lake." And that is where everything starts to unravel. Julia stood frozen with the note in her hand, rereading the words over and over. Ask Mason what happened at the lake. It didn't make sense. They didn't live near any lake. There was no family cabin, no summer trips to a waterfront. But the phrase wasn't what rattled her most. It was how the note got there. The door had been locked. The Ring camera battery had mysteriously died that morning. And Mason had been home with her all day. There was no sound, no footsteps, no vehicle. Whoever left it wanted her to know they could get close, without being seen. That alone was terrifying. But what happened next made things even worse. When Julia asked Mason about the lake, his demeanor shifted entirely. His face went pale, his voice dropped low, and he shook his head so subtly it was barely noticeable. "I can't talk about it. He told me not to." No matter how many times she tried, he wouldn't say another word. Later that night, she found him sitting on his bedroom floor, drawing again. Not the man this time, but a small boat in the middle of a foggy lake, and something beneath the water reaching up from the deep. Determined to figure out what the lake meant, Julia called her mother, hoping maybe there was something from Mason's early childhood that she'd missed. That's when she learned something she'd never been told before. When Mason was 2 years old, Julia had gone through a rough patch. She was overwhelmed, newly single, and struggling to stay afloat. During that time, her mother took Mason for a weekend out at a rental cabin 2 hours north, on a small, secluded lake called Craven Hollow. Julia had no memory of it because her mother had kept it quiet, wanting to give her a break. "Nothing happened," she said over the phone. "He just played by the water. You were so exhausted, honey. I didn't want to burden you with details." But now Julia wasn't so sure. She looked up the location. It was real. Still there. Still rentable. Still open to the public. And with that, a new question burned in her mind. What could have happened to Mason at a place she didn't even remember him visiting? The next morning, she tried to access the digital file of Mason's most recent drawing, the one with the lake. She always scanned them into her computer for safekeeping, but this time the file was gone. Not misplaced, deleted. And not just that one. Every single scanned image Mason had drawn of the man was gone. The folder was empty. Julia panicked, assuming it was a tech issue. She brought the computer to a repair specialist, but what they found chilled her. The files hadn't been erased normally. They were manually scrubbed, metadata removed, file histories wiped clean. "This isn't your average virus," the technician told her. "It's like someone knew exactly what they were looking for and didn't want it recovered." That's when Julia realized something horrifying. The only way someone could have accessed those files remotely was if they had hacked into her network. Or worse, if they were already inside the house. Julia changed her locks, installed new security cameras, switched out her router. But none of it gave her peace. And just as she began to feel like she was making progress, another complication threw her completely off course. Detective Ray Blanton, the retired investigator who had offered to help, went radio silent. No texts, no calls, no email replies. His number was disconnected. She called his old department to ask if anyone had heard from him, and the answer shocked her. Ray had died 3 years ago. Heart attack. Buried in Maryland. The department sent her an obituary and a link to the archived news coverage. The man she'd spoken to, the man who visited her house and saw Mason's drawings, wasn't Ray Blanton. So who had it been? Fearing she'd been manipulated, Julia contacted the local police. But when she tried to file a report, the officer in charge of her case didn't take her seriously. "Look, we get a lot of this internet stuff," he said with a shrug. "Viral stories, creepy drawings. It's hard to separate truth from clickbait." He smiled politely, then added, "Unless someone's in immediate danger, there's not much we can do." It was clear she was on her own. And that's when a new character entered the picture, someone Julia didn't expect. Her neighbor, Darren. Quiet guy, mid-40s, always kept to himself. She barely exchanged more than a wave with him over the years. But one evening, as she unloaded groceries, he approached her and said, "You need to stop digging. This thing you're chasing, it doesn't like to be found." At first, she thought he was joking, but the look in his eyes said otherwise. "You're not the first to see him. I did too. When I was a kid. Drew him every week for a year. Everyone thought I was crazy. And then he disappeared. Just like that. But not before taking something from me I never got back." Darren wouldn't say what he lost. Wouldn't say where the man came from, or how he knew. But his warning was clear. If Julia didn't stop pressing, there would be consequences. He left her with a cryptic message. He feeds on attention. The more people see him, the more real he becomes. You think posting those pictures was helping? You're just giving him power. That night, Julia took down the original post, deleted the thread, tried to erase every trace of Mason's drawings online. But it was too late. Screenshots were already out there. The story had spread, picked up by true crime YouTubers, Reddit threads, even TikTok creators under hashtag haunted drawing, hashtag mystery face, and hashtag kids say she's real. The man had become a trending topic, and if Darren was right, that attention was only making him stronger. And just when Julia thought she'd seen the worst of it, Mason finally broke his silence. One evening, as thunder rolled in and the wind scratched at the windows, he came into her room clutching a small, weathered photo. "I found it under the floorboard," he said. Julia took it, hands shaking. It was an old, faded Polaroid taken at Craven Hollow Lake. In the background was the water, the trees, and Mason as a toddler, standing on the dock. But he wasn't alone. A tall figure stood behind him, barely visible in the shadows. Same military jacket. Same scar on his cheek. The same man he had drawn again and again. Someone had taken a photo of Mason with him. Someone had been there that day. But the real question, the one that made her stomach twist, was this. Who was holding the camera? And just as she went to flip the photo over to check the date, there was a knock at the door. 3 short raps. Same as before. Julia didn't move. The knock at the door, 3 precise raps, froze her in place. She stood in the hallway, one hand gripping the edge of the photo Mason had just handed her, the other instinctively pulling him closer. The porch light flickered faintly through the front window as thunder rumbled again in the distance. She checked the time. 11:27 p.m. No deliveries. No expected visitors. No reason anyone should be knocking. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she tiptoed to the door, careful not to make noise on the creaky wood floor. She looked through the peephole. No one. Not a soul on the porch. She opened the door slowly, cautiously, with a tremble in her hand. The porch was empty, but something caught her eye, a manila envelope resting on the doormat. There was no postage, no name, just a red mark in the center like a fingerprint smeared in something too dark to be ink. Inside were 4 items: a USB drive, an old newspaper clipping from 1997, a child's drawing, different from Mason's, and a sticky note with a single phrase, "You're not the only one." Julia stared at the contents under the kitchen light, barely breathing. The newspaper clipping described a missing child named Evelyn Strickland, age 7, who vanished while vacationing with her family at, of all places, Craven Hollow Lake. There were no leads. The family moved away shortly after. Julia had never heard the name before. She took the USB drive to her laptop and plugged it in, half expecting it to trigger some sort of virus. Instead, it contained a single video file labeled EVS_footage_98, MOV. The video opened with static, then the shaky view of a handheld camcorder recording a child's birthday party, streamers, balloons, kids laughing. A little girl with bright blonde pigtails was blowing out candles. Julia's skin prickled when she heard someone off-camera say, "Go ahead, Evelyn, show them your drawing." The girl held up a crayon sketch of the same tall man in the military jacket. The same scar. The same blank eyes. And then the camera jerked, as if someone had taken it by force. The footage cut out. Julia replayed it twice, then sat in silence, overwhelmed by the impossible. Someone else had drawn him too, nearly 30 years ago. Before Julia could process it, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Melissa, her older sister, who lived 2 states away and rarely reached out unless it was important. "Hey, is Mason okay? I had the weirdest thing happen tonight. Olivia's been drawing that man again." Julia nearly dropped the phone. Olivia was Melissa's daughter, Mason's cousin, 9 years old. And she'd drawn the same man? Again? Julia immediately called her, voice shaking as she demanded answers. Melissa explained that years ago, when Olivia was 5, she went through a phase of sketching the same strange man over and over, but eventually stopped after therapy. It had been dismissed as imagination, some trauma response from a preschool incident they never fully understood. But tonight, out of nowhere, Olivia had woken from a nightmare and started drawing him again, with chilling detail. "She called him the Watcher," Melissa whispered. "Said he's mad because people are looking for him again. She said he remembers who didn't believe her." Julia felt her blood run cold. It wasn't just Mason. It wasn't just her. And it wasn't new. This thing, whatever it was, had been circling their family, creeping across state lines, leaving breadcrumbs that no one had followed until now. But that realization brought no comfort, only dread, because it meant that something had kept it quiet all this time, and now that it was being seen, shared, posted, and discussed, it was reawakening, reclaiming its territory. But then came another twist that shattered what little confidence she had left. Julia began researching Evelyn Strickland, hoping to find any trace of her family. She found a recent real estate record linked to the name, and Evelyn Strickland, now Evelyn Boyd, living less than 90 miles away. Married. No children. Julia tracked down her Facebook profile, barely updated, mostly private. But one public photo stood out. It was from 4 months ago, a black and white shot of Evelyn standing in front of an old building. The caption read, "Back to where it all went wrong. Some ghosts stay with you." Julia zoomed in on the photo, and her stomach dropped. Behind Evelyn, nearly hidden in the shadows near the edge of the frame, stood a man in a military coat. Julia wasn't sure what to do next. She tried messaging Evelyn but got no reply. She called the real estate office listed on the public records and left a message. Nothing. But the next morning, as she was walking Mason to school, a strange car drove slowly past her house. She didn't recognize the make or the license plate, but the driver looked straight at her and then sped off. That night, she found a second envelope, this time inside her mailbox. No fingerprint. No return address. Inside was a typed message. "You're in danger. Stop sharing the story, or your son disappears like the others." Julia clutched the letter, her hands trembling. The note wasn't just a threat. It was confirmation. Someone was watching. Someone knew exactly what she was doing. And worst of all, someone had the power to act on it. As the fear closed in on her, the line between past and present blurred. Who was lying? Who was hiding the truth? Could Mason's drawings be a cry for help from something buried deep in his subconscious? Or were they a warning to stop what she'd unknowingly set into motion? And with other children like Olivia now involved, Julia realized the stakes had just changed. It wasn't about solving a mystery anymore. It was about survival. But the most disturbing part? The next morning, Mason handed her a brand new drawing, different from the others. This time it was a house. Their house. And in the upstairs window, a dark figure stared out, watching the street below. Underneath the drawing, he had written one sentence. He lives here now. Julia hadn't slept more than 2 hours in the last 2 nights, and it was beginning to show. Her eyes, usually sharp and steady, twitched involuntarily as she stared out the window with a mug of cold coffee clutched in her hands. Mason had stopped drawing, but not because the visions went away. If anything, he'd become quieter, watchful, like he knew something she didn't. Or maybe like he was being told not to say it out loud. The message in his last drawing haunted her. He lives here now. That house in his sketch had been their own, replicated down to the crooked gutter on the front porch. Julia had even gone outside to check the window in his drawing, the one with the dark figure staring out, and nearly collapsed when she saw her own curtains slightly parted, even though she was certain they had been shut tight the night before. That moment, standing barefoot on the damp lawn with the early morning mist swirling around her, was when it finally hit her. This was no longer just about dreams, or drawings, or unsolved stories from decades ago. Whatever this was, it had entered her life. It was inside her home. She started noticing things that didn't belong. Small, subtle things that could easily be explained away, if she hadn't already seen too much. A chair in the hallway facing a different direction than how she left it. The back door unlocked, even after she had double-checked it the night before. Her favorite mug, cracked right down the center, sitting on the table when she was sure it had been in the dishwasher. She told herself she was overthinking. She told herself this was what sleep deprivation did. But when she found Mason's stuffed bear in the freezer, drenched in melted ice and freezer burn, she knew something else was happening. Mason denied putting it there. He swore he didn't even know it was missing. When she pressed him, asked him what he remembered about the man in the coat, he simply looked up at her with tired eyes and whispered, "He doesn't want me to talk to you anymore." Julia's world cracked a little more with each passing hour. She felt like she was constantly being watched. Cars slowed down as they passed the house. Her cell phone began receiving glitchy voicemails, static, hissing, occasional whispers that were too warped to understand. At first, she blamed spam, maybe even a prank. But then, one message came through clearly. A man's voice, raspy, deliberate, sounding like he was too close to the microphone, said her name. Just that. Nothing else. No context. Just Julia, followed by 3 seconds of silence and the faint sound of a child breathing in the background. She dropped her phone. It shattered. And for the first time, she locked every door in the house and pulled Mason out of school. She called the police, but the officer who came out seemed unconvinced. He jotted down her statement with that polite, patronizing smile Julia had grown to despise. Kids draw strange things. It's probably nothing. And unless there's a break-in, there's not much we can do, he said. Julia tried to explain the drawing of the man, how other children had seen him, too. How there was a pattern stretching back decades. But he just looked at her like she'd been watching too many horror movies. She didn't blame him. She wouldn't have believed herself 2 weeks ago. But as he got into his squad car, Julia noticed something. In the back seat, tucked between the radio and the seatbelt latch, was a child's drawing. She caught just a glimpse, but it was enough. A lanky figure in a long coat, and that same jagged scar across the left cheek. When she looked up, the officer was staring at her in the rearview mirror. Not smiling anymore, just watching. The final straw came when her sister stopped answering her calls. Melissa had promised to bring Olivia over so the cousins could talk, maybe draw side by side, see if anything overlapped. But the night before their visit, Julia got a voicemail from a hospital 2 hours away. Melissa's car had been found abandoned off a rural highway. No crash. No sign of struggle. Just her phone on the driver's seat, still recording. Olivia was missing. Melissa was unconscious and now in a medically induced coma. The footage from the dashcam had been wiped. Technical failure, the staff claimed, but a local nurse slipped Julia a USB that someone had turned in anonymously. "You didn't get this from me," she whispered and walked away before Julia could thank her. The footage on the drive was brief and horrifying. A still frame, distorted and grainy, showed Olivia sitting in the back seat, crying. Then the camera fizzled, and in one flickering frame before it went black, the tall man appeared in the middle of the road, staring straight into the lens. His expression didn't change. He didn't blink. He was just there. And then he wasn't. Julia sat in her car in the hospital parking lot for nearly 20 minutes, unable to breathe. Everything was unraveling too fast. Mason was next. She could feel it. But the question that kept clawing at her chest wasn't just who this man was, or how long he'd been around.
It was why.
Why was he choosing them? Why had he shown himself through drawings? Why now? And more disturbingly, how had he followed their family across generations without anyone ever putting it together? What did he want? When she returned home that night, there was another drawing waiting on her kitchen counter. This time, it wasn't from Mason. The lines were older, shakier. The paper yellowed. The drawing showed Julia, her exact face, sitting in her living room, staring at a blank TV screen. And behind her, drawn in the shadows near the hallway door, was the man in the coat. Only this time, he wasn't watching. He was smiling. There were no fingerprints, no signs of entry. Mason had been with her all day, and yet the drawing had appeared. The lights flickered again. Julia stared at the picture, her hands trembling, and realized with horror that the drawing wasn't just a warning. It was a prophecy. And the scene in the sketch? It was happening right now. Julia sat frozen, the drawing still clutched in her trembling hands, when her phone lit up with an unknown number. For a moment, she debated ignoring it. Her nerves were frayed, and every unknown call since this all began felt like another thread unraveling from her sanity. But something compelled her to answer. Maybe desperation. Maybe instinct. The voice on the other end didn't say hello. It didn't even ask if she was safe. It just said, "You need to come to 1413 West Pine. Bring the boy. He's the key to all of this. But come alone." Then the line went dead. Julia stood there, her pulse thudding in her ears, staring at the screen as the number vanished. It wasn't a request, it was a command. One that made her skin crawl, but something deeper inside her whispered that this was the moment everything was about to change. She didn't want to take Mason, not after everything. But when she turned to tell him he had to stay, he was already at the door, shoes on, coat zipped, staring at her calmly like he had known where they were going before she even got the call. That unnerved her more than anything else. Mason hadn't spoken much in days. And now here he was ready. "You drew this?" she asked, holding up the latest sketch, her voice cracking. "Was this you?" He shook his head once, slowly. "It was Grandpa," he said softly. Julia froze. Her father had died almost a decade ago. "What do you mean, Grandpa?" she whispered. "He said it's time to tell you the truth," Mason replied. "It wasn't supposed to come back to us." Julia's heart pounded as she drove them across town to the address. West Pine was a half-abandoned stretch of forgotten houses and weed-choked lots that looked like they'd been left behind decades ago. When they pulled up to 1413, it wasn't what she expected. The house was well-kept, freshly painted even, with a porch light glowing warm against the dusk. Something about that felt wrong, like a mask was covering up what really lived there. Mason held her hand tighter as they walked to the door. Before she could knock, it opened. And standing there, older but unmistakable, was her Uncle Ray. Ray had disappeared when Julia was 11. He'd vanished during a hunting trip, and the family assumed the worst after no trace of him was found. Julia barely remembered him, just flashes of a smiling man who used to sneak her cookies and tell her bedtime stories that always seemed a little too dark for kids. And yet, Here he was, not just alive, but waiting for them. He stepped aside and motioned them in, his eyes sunken and tired. "We don't have much time," he said. "He's waking up again." Inside the house, Ray explained everything, and the truth was worse than anything Julia had imagined. The man in the coat wasn't a ghost or some shared hallucination. He was real. His name was Elias Grayer, a former child psychologist who had been experimenting on children in secret decades ago, including members of their own family. He believed that traumatic memories could be erased or implanted through extreme isolation and suggestive therapy, often using drawings and subconscious visual triggers. But somewhere along the line, he lost control of the experiment. Or maybe he wanted to. Elias had vanished after a scandal in the late 70s, and every child he had worked with went on to develop recurring visions, sleep disturbances, and obsessive drawing habits. Julia's father had been one of them. Her grandfather, Mason's great-grandfather, had discovered Elias's methods and spent years trying to undo the damage. He kept it buried, erasing any mention from family records and swearing Julia's father to silence. But the trauma, it turned out, was genetic, passed down not just in memories, but in patterns, behavior, instincts. Julia's father had drawn the same man Mason now drew. So had Ray. But Ray hadn't disappeared by accident. He went into hiding, trying to find and destroy whatever was left of Elias's research. And now, all signs pointed to one chilling conclusion: Elias wasn't dead. He was continuing his work. And Mason, with his unfiltered mind and artistic talent, had somehow tapped back into that suppressed network of buried memories, making him a beacon for Elias, or worse, a subject. But there was something else. Something Ray hesitated to say. Julia pressed him, and his eyes watered as he finally admitted it. "You were supposed to be next, Julia. Your father convinced Elias to spare you, but only by offering him something else." "Me." Julia reeled back. "You're saying Dad traded you?" Ray nodded. "He thought I was already too far gone. But it didn't matter. Elias didn't want me, he wanted legacy. Continuation. You were protected, but your son wasn't." Julia's mind was spinning. Everything she believed, everything she'd feared, was part of a larger truth too massive to fully grasp. The man in the coat wasn't haunting them. He had designed them. Their dreams, their fears, their behaviors. Everything was part of a blueprint started long before Mason was born. And now, Mason was reactivating it, unraveling something that should have stayed buried. Before she could even respond, a loud knock shattered the silence of the room. All three of them turned. Ray's face went pale. "No one knows we're here," he whispered. The knock came again, louder. Then a voice. "Julia, open the door. You left something behind." It was her sister's voice. Melissa. But Melissa was in a coma. Or at least, that's what they told her. Julia's hand hovered near the doorknob, heart pounding like it wanted out of her chest. The voice on the other side sounded exactly like Melissa, every inflection familiar, every syllable right, but that only made it more terrifying. She hadn't seen her sister conscious in nearly 3 years. Not since the car accident that put Melissa in the ICU with a traumatic brain injury. Doctors said her chances of waking up were slim to none. Julia had grieved the loss of her sister long before the machines were even unplugged. And yet now, here she was, or someone pretending to be her, calling from behind a locked door, speaking as if no time had passed. It defied logic. But logic had stopped meaning anything ever since Mason started drawing the man in the coat. Ray grabbed Julia's wrist before she could touch the doorknob. "That's not your sister," he whispered. "Not anymore." His grip was strong but trembling, like he knew something he wasn't saying. Mason stood behind them, silent and pale, clinging to his sketchpad like it was his only anchor to reality. The knock stopped suddenly, and the voice shifted tone, harsher now, almost glitching in and out like a corrupted recording. "Open the door, Julia," it rasped. "He's almost here. And when he comes, you'll wish you had." Julia backed away, hands shaking. She was no longer sure if she was protecting her son or being used to deliver him. Nothing made sense, and everything pointed to a truth she wasn't ready to face. Ray said Elias Grayer was a real person.
A man.
But what if he had become something else? Something that no longer fit into a name, or a face, or even a physical form? What if whatever Elias created had slipped into something deeper, darker, passed on through thoughts, genes, sketches? Julia didn't know. She just knew she had no idea who she could trust anymore. Later that night, after Ray had boarded up the windows and unplugged every electronic device in the house, Julia sat across from him in the kitchen, her voice hoarse. "You knew this would come back. Why didn't you warn me?" Ray looked older now than he had hours ago, his eyes hollowed out by guilt. "Because I made a deal too," he said, barely above a whisper. "I told your father I'd help cover it up. We thought if we destroyed the tapes, the notes, the art therapy logs, everything Elias left behind, it would end with us. But I lied. I kept something. I thought I could use it to track Elias down. Instead, it's what brought him back." Julia's breath caught. "You're saying this is your fault?" Ray didn't deny it. He reached beneath the floorboard and pulled out a worn leather journal, its pages yellowed and warped by time. "This is the original protocol," he said. "Elias's complete patient method. The drawings, the timelines, the codes, they're all in here, including how to open the memory gate." Julia didn't understand what that meant until she flipped through it and saw a familiar face drawn again and again in pencil. Mason's face. She slammed the book shut. How is that possible? Mason wasn't even born when this was written. Ray looked at her with eyes full of dread. That's the point. He didn't need to be. Elias believed memories could be inherited. That if a parent carried the imprint of trauma deep enough, a child would express it even stronger. Mason's not the first prototype. He's the final one. That night, Julia sat by Mason's side as he slept, watching his chest rise and fall with every shallow breath. The weight of the choice she now faced sat like stone in her gut. If she destroyed the journal, maybe she could break the link. But if she did, she might lose the only key to understanding what Elias wanted and how to stop him. But holding on to it risked Mason being pulled in even deeper. Worse still, if Elias really was using Mason to rebuild his experiments, Julia had to ask herself a question no mother should ever face. Would protecting her son mean destroying what was left of him? The next morning, her decision was ripped from her hands. She awoke to find the journal gone and Ray unconscious in the hallway with a note pinned to his chest in red marker. It read, "You had one job. Now she must decide." Julia's blood ran cold. There were no fingerprints, no signs of a break-in, just the journal gone, and Ray, breathing but unresponsive. Later that afternoon, her phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. Against every survival instinct screaming at her, she answered. "You want the truth?" the voice said. "Bring Mason to the observatory at dusk. No more running." Before she could respond, the line went dead. But this time, there was no debate. The choice wasn't between truth and safety anymore, it was survival. Julia had to face the monster in the code, whoever or whatever he truly was. But now she was alone. Ray couldn't help her. Melissa might not even be alive. And Mason, he was drawing again. But this time, the picture wasn't of the man. It was of Julia. And in the drawing, her eyes were closed. The observatory loomed like a silent sentinel over the hills, its dome cracked with age, its purpose long forgotten by anyone who didn't grow up in the town. Julia stood at the base of the steps, heart pounding, clutching Mason's hand as the sun bled out across the horizon. The wind howled like a warning, and for the first time in her life, Julia understood what it felt like to be prey. She had no idea what she was walking into, only that the answers she'd been chasing were waiting at the top. But she wasn't ready for what those answers would cost her. Mason hadn't spoken a word the entire ride there. He'd just stared out the window, his sketchpad resting on his lap, a single word scrawled across the cover in red crayon. Return. The same word Elias Grayer had underlined in his notes, again and again, like a prayer or a command. As they climbed the steps, Julia's phone vibrated. It was a message. No sender, just a photo. Ray, tied to a chair, gagged, bruised. Behind him, a shadow that didn't quite match the shape of a human man. Her knees buckled, but she didn't stop. If she hesitated now, she'd never make it out alive. Inside, the observatory smelled of mildew and rust. The circular chamber at the top still housed the old telescope, now disassembled and replaced with a web of wires, screens, and blinking red lights. A low hum pulsed through the air, like a machine warming up. And standing at the center of it all, arms folded, was someone Julia never expected to see again, Dr. Cassandra Vale, her old therapist. The woman who had once promised to help her sort through her trauma after Melissa's accident. The same woman who'd vanished a year ago without warning. Julia's mouth went dry. "You," she said. "You're behind this?" Cassandra smiled, calm as ever. "Not behind," she said. "Just ahead. This was always going to happen, Julia. You're not the beginning. You're the middle." Julia shook her head, trying to process it. Cassandra had helped her through so many dark nights. They had cried together, laughed even. She trusted her. And now she was standing in the heart of the nightmare, orchestrating it all. "You used my son," Julia said, her voice breaking. "You used me." Cassandra stepped closer, not with malice, but with something far more unsettling. Pity. "You think I wanted this?" she said. "I tried to warn your father. I begged him to shut the program down when I learned what Elias was doing. But he refused. Said the data was too valuable. And then he buried it. So I did the only thing I could. I built a new way in." The walls seemed to close in as Julia put it all together. This wasn't about one man's obsession or a child's drawings. It was a network, doctors, researchers, maybe even officials, who'd known about Elias's experiments for decades. A silent conspiracy to unlock something hidden in human memory. Not just trauma, but knowledge. And Mason wasn't the first child they'd used. Cassandra gestured to a side room, and Julia's stomach dropped. Inside were photos, dozens of them, of other children, each with red marks on their foreheads, each staring blankly into the camera. A wall lined with sketches. The same face in every one. The man in the coat. "They all saw him," Cassandra said softly. "Some drew him. Some heard him. But only one survived the final stage. Mason." Julia staggered backward, ball rising in her throat. "Final stage?" she asked. Cassandra looked down. "Integration," she whispered. "If Mason completes the sequence, we won't just unlock what Elias discovered. We'll become it." Before Julia could respond, a loud crash echoed from below. A voice shouted her name, Melissa's. But it wasn't a cry for help. It was a warning. "Run." The lights flickered violently. The hum in the room shifted into a low, guttural pulse that rattled the floorboards. And then Mason stepped forward, eyes wide, pupils blown out black. His sketchpad slipped from his fingers and hit the floor, pages flipping wildly until they stopped on a new drawing, a full map of the observatory, with symbols she didn't recognize etched in every corner. Cassandra reached for Mason, but Julia pushed her away. "He's not yours," she shouted. "He's not some project." But Cassandra didn't flinch. "You don't understand," she said. "He's not your son anymore." And in that moment, Mason looked up and Julia saw it. Faint, flickering like a dying star. But it was there. Another face behind his eyes. Watching. Waiting. She grabbed Mason and turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind them with supernatural force. The room darkened to almost nothing, save for the glow of the machines and the whispers, now seeping through the walls like smoke. Julia realized then, they weren't just studying Elias Greer. They were summoning him. Or worse, bringing back whatever had taken his place. And Julia, betrayed, broken, and terrified, wasn't just fighting for Mason anymore. She was fighting to keep the world from remembering something it was never meant to know. And just as she thought it couldn't get worse, a cold, familiar voice whispered directly into her ear from the dark, "I've waited long enough." The room shuddered as the machinery roared to life, filling the observatory with a blinding red glow that pulsed in rhythm with the symbols etched across the floor. Julia stood frozen in the center, gripping Mason's hand as he trembled beside her, his face pale, his eyes unfocused. Across the chamber, Dr. Cassandra Vale stood with arms outstretched, her voice rising in a chant that no language should have ever held. The air had grown thick, suffocating, charged with a static energy that made Julia's skin crawl. This was it. This was the moment Elias Grayer had prepared for decades ago, the moment Julia's father had tried to hide, the one Cassandra had built her entire life around reviving. And her son, her little boy, was the key to all of it. Mason began to whisper something under his breath, something Julia couldn't understand. The same sequence he'd scribbled in his sleep, the one he recited during his sleepwalking episodes. Cassandra stepped toward him, slow and reverent, as if she were approaching a god. "It's almost complete," she said, her voice soft with awe. "The bridge is almost open." Julia stepped in front of Mason, her voice cracking. "He's not a bridge. He's my son. And you're not taking him." Cassandra's smile faltered for the first time. Her eyes flickered with something like sadness, then madness. "You still think this is about him?" she whispered. "Julia, he's not the first. He's just the first who came back with him still inside." Before Julia could respond, the screens lining the walls went dark, then one by one flickered on again, this time showing images Julia hadn't seen since childhood. Her own drawings. Pictures she had torn up and thrown away after Melissa's accident. The same man Mason had drawn, again and again. He wasn't just part of Mason's visions. He had been inside Julia's memories, too. She remembered now. The man in the coat had stood at the edge of her bed the night Melissa fell down the stairs. She thought he was a dream, some leftover figment from the trauma. But now, as his image stared back from every screen, she understood. He'd never left. He'd just been waiting. Mason collapsed to his knees, clutching his head. The room around them cracked with noise, deep and unnatural, like the growl of something impossibly large stirring beneath the earth. Julia knelt beside her son, tears streaming down her face, trying to reach him. "Mason, listen to me," she begged. "You are stronger than this. You don't have to let him in." But Cassandra was already moving, fingers dancing across a control panel, activating the final phase of whatever process had begun. "It's too late," she said. "The integration has started. In a few moments, he won't just be remembering Elias Grayer. He'll be him." Suddenly, a shriek cut through the room. Not from Mason or Julia, but from Cassandra herself. She reeled backward, clutching her chest as the lights exploded above them. From the shattered bulbs, black mist poured down, snaking toward the floor like living smoke. And then, as Julia turned to shield Mason, a figure emerged from the haze, tall, gaunt, and featureless. The man from the drawings. The one who haunted Julia's childhood. The one Mason had captured in every page. But now, he wasn't just an ink. He was real. Cassandra dropped to her knees, whispering something over and over. "He's awake. He's awake." Julia backed up, dragging Mason with her, but the figure didn't advance. It turned its head slowly toward her, and Julia felt the cold of its gaze pierce something deeper than flesh. "You brought me back," it said, its voice not spoken but felt, like a vibration behind her ribs. "You remembered." In that moment, Julia understood the true horror of what was happening. Elias Grayer hadn't discovered a ghost or a forgotten soul. He had unlocked a memory that wasn't human. Something older. Something that didn't belong in their world but had once brushed up against it. Through children, through dreams, through trauma. Cassandra hadn't summoned a spirit. She had opened a door. The only way to close it now was to make him forget. Julia turned to Mason and cupped his face in her hands, speaking through the chaos, past the screams, past the terror. "Mason, baby, listen to me. You don't need to remember him. You don't need to see him. Just draw something else. Anything. Something you love." Mason's hands shook as he reached for the sketch pad still clutched in Julia's arm. With every ounce of strength he had, he scratched a single image into the paper, a sun. A simple, golden sun with rays beaming outward. The moment his pencil hit the page, the figure screamed, not with anger, but with desperation. It began to dissolve, its form crumbling like ash in the wind, howling as if being pulled backward through space. The lights flickered one last time before shutting off completely, plunging the room into darkness. Then silence. When the emergency lights kicked on, Cassandra lay slumped on the floor, unconscious. The machinery was fried, sparking and smoking. Mason sat breathing hard in Julia's lap, the drawing of the sun still clutched in his fingers. And for the first time in weeks, his eyes looked clear. But before Julia could breathe a full sigh of relief, she saw it, tucked beneath the last page in the sketchpad. A shape she hadn't noticed before. Not drawn in Mason's shaky pencil lines, but in something older. Pressed faintly, like a watermark, almost invisible unless you tilted it in the light. A face. Not the man from before. A new one. And it was smiling. The days that followed moved like fog through Julia's mind, slow, thick, and hard to grasp. The facility had been shut down by federal agents who swept in after receiving an anonymous tip. Cassandra Vale was taken into custody, her life's work confiscated and locked away in unmarked evidence containers. But there were no public statements, no breaking news headlines, no official recognition of what had happened beneath the earth in that strange research compound. It was as if the government had closed the book before anyone could read the final chapter. Julia knew better. She'd lived through the kind of truth that doesn't make headlines, the kind that hides behind polite silence and redacted files. And even now, with Mason safe at home and the nightmares gone quiet for the first time in months, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them back, some shadow that hadn't fully dissolved when the figure vanished in that room. Mason returned to school, slowly reintegrating into the normal rhythm of childhood. He laughed more. He slept through the night. And he hadn't drawn the man since that final day. Instead, his sketchbook filled with bright colors and soft shapes, trees, parks, animals, family portraits that always showed him standing between Julia and a smiling dad, even though Mason had never known his father. Julia didn't correct him. In fact, she found comfort in the warmth of those pictures, like Mason was rewriting the past into something safer. Maybe that's how healing worked, layering over the old wounds with gentler brushstrokes, one page at a time. And yet, in quiet moments when the house was still and her son slept down the hall, Julia found herself drifting back to that final image hidden beneath the sun drawing. The smiling face that hadn't been Mason's. The one no one could explain. She tried researching it, comparing it to old photographs, even reaching out to a few trusted contacts in the paranormal research community, but no one had ever seen anything like it. It wasn't part of the Elias Grayer files. It wasn't referenced in Cassandra's seized data. It just existed. There was a part of Julia that wanted desperately to burn that sketchbook, to erase every trace of what they'd endured. But another part, stronger now, understood that the past can't be destroyed, only accepted. What they had witnessed, what Mason had endured, was more than just psychological trauma or hallucination. It was a fracture in the veil, a brief glimpse behind the curtain most people never even realize exists. And if it could happen once, it could happen again. Julia didn't know why her family had been marked, or why Mason had become the vessel for something ancient and unknowable, but she no longer lived in denial. She stayed vigilant, reading between the lines of news reports, listening for patterns, noting any signs that someone else might be remembering what shouldn't be remembered. And most nights, when Mason was tucked in bed, Julia would sit by his door and sketch. She wasn't an artist, but it wasn't about talent, it was about control. About reclaiming the imagery that once haunted her. She would draw Mason holding her hand under a blue sky, or the two of them feeding ducks at the pond, or watching fireworks on the 4th of July. Normal American memories. Gentle ones. Protective ones. But on the anniversary of that day, exactly 1 year after the lab was shut down, something strange happened. Julia came home from work to find Mason sitting quietly at the table, his sketchbook open, a new drawing in progress. He looked calm, almost content, but there was a distance in his expression that made Julia's stomach twist. "Hey, what are you working on?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. Mason looked up, smiled softly, and pushed the book toward her. "I saw him again," he said, "but not like before." Julia hesitated before glancing down, and what she saw stopped her breath cold. The figure was back, but altered. The coat was different, darker. The face wasn't smiling anymore, it was watching. Behind him, another smaller figure stood, partially drawn, like it was fading into existence. Julia stared at it for a long time before she spoke. "Who is that?" she whispered. Mason shrugged. "I don't know, but he said he used to be someone else. Someone like me." Julia closed the book without another word, her hands trembling ever so slightly. She didn't want to scare Mason, didn't want to unravel the peace they'd fought so hard to restore. But that moment confirmed what she had always feared deep down. This wasn't over. It never had been. As the sun set behind the horizon and the quiet hum of the suburban neighborhood settled in, Julia sat on the porch, watching the shadows stretch long across the yard. The wind rustled through the trees in a way that made her look twice, heart pounding a little faster than usual. It could have been nothing. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe it was a memory walking its way back into the world. And somewhere deep in the distance, beyond what the human eye can see and the mind dares to name, something remembered her too.